deficit of $3.2 billion. Add those two numbers together, that's half the budget. That's half the state budget. And by the way, just a year ago, the state budget was $10.2 billion. It's now $8.6 because we cut a bunch of stuff. We stopped caring for people. So even with the new lower budget of $8.6 billion, we're about half of it in the hole. So the governor has a proposal that she says will fill the hole, and it involves a 1-cent sales tax increase that would generate about $800 million a year for 3 years. In addition, she intends to cut $750 million from our K-12 public education system. $750 million. $750 million. Right now, the average class size is around 31 to 33 students per classroom. After this cut, it'll be closer to 39 to 40, maybe even 41. Like in a third grade classroom. The rooms aren't even big enough. Yes?
Aren't we 51st now in the country?
Yeah, we're closing in on Puerto Rico. Yeah, we are at the very bottom. We're at the very bottom already. Mississippi must be so proud. Yes?
It seems to me that our budget deficit is going up faster than the inflation, which we don't seem to have a tremendous amount of.
Right.
So is this a result of their reducing taxes instead of holding where they are?
There's three things that have caused this. Number one, during good times, we made permanent cuts to taxes. So for those of you who were here back in 05, 06, 07, you saw a slight bump in the amount of take-home pay that you had because we dropped income taxes for all Arizonans. Now, you probably didn't notice a huge bump because income tax is already really, really small in Arizona, especially when compared to your federal taxes. We also made a number of corporate taxes, and we suspended a number of taxes for quite some time. So those were permanent decreases in our revenue. So our revenue was here, and during good times when we had extra money, we made permanent decreases in revenue. At the same time, we also made permanent increases in spending. And the Republicans mentioned that about how we cut the revenue by getting rid of a bunch of taxes. The truth is that both of those things actually widened the gap between what our revenue is and what our expenditures were. Okay, so we were going along like this, and then when we had some extra money for a couple of years, we made permanent tax cuts, and we increased spending permanently. So that kind of made almost like an alligator's mouth situation. So was it one party's fault? No, it was bipartisan. I'll totally honest. We wanted increased spending because we wanted full-day kindergarten. I'm still glad that we did that. That's $218 million a year, and I believe it's worth it. Tax cuts were much greater than $218 million a year. But those two things combined meant that when the boom ended, our structural deficit was bigger because we had given those permanent tax cuts and we increased permanent spending. So that's two reasons. The third thing is quite simple. During tough economic times, people get poor. Right? People lose their jobs, and they then qualify for what we call entitlement programs, right? So Medicaid, which in Arizona we call Access, Kids Care, which is the federal program is called S-CHIP, and that was a Ted Kennedy program, and that provides health care for the working class and their children. And then we also see an increase in enrollment for things like WIC, which is Women, Infants, and Children, TANF, which is Temporary Assistance to Needy Families. Those all fall under the umbrella of what you call welfare. Right? Those are programs that people qualify for based on their income. So during tough economic times, more people qualify because they have less income. So for instance, the application and enrollment in Access has drastically increased over the last 6 months. And that's been a little bit problematic because the amount of money in our bank account has drastically reduced over the last 6 months. Does that make sense? So we've got rising need and decreasing revenue, plus the structural deficit that we created back in 05 and 06. And I think that's a very unbiased and very honest perspective. Many Democrats will only blame the tax cuts. Many Republicans will only blame the increases in spending. The truth is, it was a combination of both. One was a lot bigger than the other, but it was a combination of both. So that's how we got into this pickle. That and the fact that we have an incredibly unbalanced tax system. About 54% of our state taxes come from the sales tax. And the sales tax is, as you know, a consumer tax. And so what do you do during tough times, tough economic times? you spend less, which is smart, because then you get to keep your home and your car and your kids. Yeah, so you spend less, and that makes sense. And if you're going to spend, you spend on stuff you need, like food or tires, right, for your car, rent, heat, air conditioning, things like that. What you don't do is spend on stuff that you don't need as much. And so what we see during tough economic times is that the sales tax revenue drops significantly because people have quit doing spending that's not necessary. They even quit doing some spending that is necessary, right? And that makes sense. That's what you should do during a tough economic time. The problem is that because our state budget is so dependent on that, it's a very volatile tax, right? So when times were good, the sales tax revenue was high, 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 and now when times are bad, our sales tax revenue is low, low, low. And we don't have a very strong base of revenue that comes from income or property tax. You know, we don't have a statewide property tax. Those of you who've moved here from other states, anyone from the Northeast? So New Hampshire, your annual property tax is more than I make.
It's twice what I was paying,
right.
what I'm paying now, but we had 0% sales tax.
Right, exactly. Did you guys all see what Oregon did last week? So Oregon doesn't have a sales tax either. And then just last week on the ballot, the voters said that they wanted to tax corporations and the rich. And something you need to know about Oregon, you might think, oh, it's so liberal. They hate taxes. They hate taxes. They like the woods, they hate taxes. That's Oregon, right? It's kind of like us. We like guns. We don't like taxes. So in terms of taxation, Oregon is very similar to us. But they have a much healthier system because they don't have a sales tax. Their tax is built on property income tax. So our tax is heavily, heavily dependent on sales tax, which leads to a very unbalanced and volatile tax system, which means during tough economic times, we go in the toilet. So that's been a real problem for us. Which is why Democrats aren't crazy about the idea of the governor's plan, because her plan to get more money is to increase sales tax, which is the one that's in the toilet right now, right? Because no one's shopping for good reason. So we were thinking that maybe doing some other things to get the money we need might be a better plan, and that overall it would help create less volatility in the system. So we proposed a plan that simply closes loopholes. There are about $10 billion of loopholes in our tax code that if closed, even if you only close like a tiny fraction of them, you could actually lower our sales tax by making sure that you're closing those loopholes and spreading it out more evenly across the population, including corporations and the rich. And it makes it more fair so everyone's paying their fair share. It actually would decrease the amount of money that an average Arizonan pays in their sales tax. We think it's a brilliant plan. It's based on the World Bank's model, which they've used in countries around the world. And interestingly enough, the Goldwater Institute endorses the plan. So it's certainly not a crazy liberal plan, right? Yeah, well, the governor and the Republicans don't like it. So the governor wants to increase the sales tax by 1 penny for 3 years. And she also wants to cut $750 million from education. She also wants to make further cuts to Department of Economic Security, which is the one that's really taken a hit. She wants to make the Department of Water Resources and the Department of Environmental Quality completely self-funding so that they're not really government entities any longer. Look on the bright side. EPA might come in and take over. Yay, that would be great. And importantly, she wants to roll back Prop 204. Now, I don't know how long some of y'all have lived here in Arizona, but you know, we're a pretty initiative-happy state, right? So there's, 14, 20 initiatives on every ballot, and it takes you like 3 hours to just get through them. Well, back in 1996, the voters passed an initiative called Healthy Arizona. And that initiative said, hey, we've got this tobacco settlement money from the federal government. You guys remember the tobacco case where they're like, oops, yeah, we do make it addictive and it causes cancer. Sorry. And they had to give money to the states. So a group of advocates, largely based out of Tucson, brought an initiative to the ballot that said, hey, we want to use that money for health care for low-income and working families. And the voters passed it, and the legislature ignored it and gutted it. And then in 1998, the voters passed an initiative that said, hey, actually, if we pass an initiative, legislature, you don't get to mess with it. Thank goodness, right? And that is what we call Prop 105. There have been a lot of Prop 105s since then, but this is the famous one. Prop 105 was a voters' initiative that said the legislature can't alter or ignore or refuse to follow any initiative passed by a majority of Arizona's voters in that election. And the only thing the legislature can do is tweak it if they have a supermajority of members in the legislature, and if the tweak is intended to